In this screencast entitled Make It Stick, I'm going to consider some evidence-informed techniques that will help students to study and revise much more effectively. Now I'm going to aim to do three things in this presentation. I'm going to focus on what research from cognitive psychology indicates about memory and learning. I'm going to explain how we might use these insights to help students develop more effective forms of self-study and revision, and I'm going to show you two online systems that can help to put those principles into practice. And by the way, the title of this presentation is based on the title of this particular book that I really recommend as an accessible introduction to cognitive psychology and the implications that this has for teachers and students. One of the things that prompted me to think harder about learning and memory was the challenge of the linear A-level. So one of the huge challenges of linear A-levels for our students is the fact that they've got to remember all of their material from their 2-year course for terminal examinations at the end of the second year. And as this graph demonstrates, our memories tend to erode very, very quickly. So even if we've got to the end of a lesson and been able to understand and remember the content of that lesson, by the next day already we would have forgotten a lot of that material, and then by the next week, the next month, the end of the year, there might be very little that we can actually remember. And it seems to me that from a student perspective, far too often learning during a course is simply a string of new stuff waiting to be forgotten. And of course that makes it much harder for students to grasp new ideas, because the way in which we make sense of new material is to relate it to the knowledge that we've already got stored in our long-term memory. And of course that becomes very problematic if students are forgetting material very quickly. What you can see on this slide are 10 different study techniques that are widely used across a range of subjects, and they're ranked here according to their utility, and this is based on rigorous research from cognitive psychology, both research that's been done under controlled laboratory situations as well as research done on real classrooms. And what is interesting about this is those techniques that seem to have the least effectiveness tend to be those techniques that students use the most often. So if you ask students what strategies they use to prepare for exams, for example, very often, if they're honest, they will talk about how they reread their notes, how they highlight their notes, how they engage in cramming or maths practice, or how they simply write out their notes again. Now, in order to demonstrate why things like rereading and highlighting are not very effective, I just want to get you to do a quick activity. I'd like you just to have a think about what is on the other side of a £10 note. So just maybe jot down everything that you can remember about what's on the other side of a £10 note. Now, when I've done this activity with students and with teachers, very few people can remember very much about the other side of a £10 note. Hardly anybody, for example, remembers that the individual on the other side of the £10 note is in fact Charles Darwin, even though this is something that we've seen thousands of times. And what I think this illustrates is that shallow repetition, i.e. repetition that doesn't require much thought or processing, is not particularly helpful if we want to remember things. And this, I think, is the underlying problem with some of the revision techniques that students tend to default to. So things like rereading and highlighting are essentially a very shallow form of repetition. They don't require much thought. In fact, sometimes when students are engaging in these study activities, their mind is often elsewhere. So even as their eyes glide over the page, their mind might be thinking about what they want to be doing after they finish their study session. So I would argue that a lot of students, even very hard-working students, are often wasting their time using study strategies that have very low effectiveness. And that's a huge opportunity cost because students could be putting their time into study techniques that the research suggests have much higher utility. Now, obviously, there can be a place for students rereading their notes if they've not looked at a topic for quite a while. They may initially have to reread their notes, but after then, students should really focus on a strategy called retrieval practice. And this simply involves students testing themselves on material and seeing what they can recall from their memory. Now, a very useful Twitter account to follow if you're interested in cognitive science and the implications for teaching is the Learning Scientists Twitter account. And I really like this particular tweet and this particular image that goes with it. And it's the argument that, rereading leaves the information on the page because it's a shallow form of repetition. It doesn't require very much processing, whereas testing yourself makes you engage your memory. And as the cognitive science Daniel Willingham argues, memory is the residue of thought. So if we want to remember things for the exam, the types of reviews and repetitions that we engage in during our self-study and revision need to involve a deeper form of processing. They need to require students to think hard. Another big benefit of retrieval practice over things like rereading and highlighting is it gives students really objective feedback about what things they are able to remember and what things they need to go back over and study and test themselves on again. With rereading and highlighting, it's a bit like the example of the £10 note that I showed you earlier. The familiarity with the material when you engage in rereading and highlighting can lure you into a false sense of security and can make you believe that you could remember the material when objectively you might not be able to do that. Now, the benefits of retrieval practice, or quite simply self-quizzing, is known within cognitive psychology as the testing effect. So one of the most robust findings from research from cognitive psychology is that this type of study pattern that involves students studying material and then repeatedly testing themselves on that material is likely to result in better test results than the other strategies that you can see on the screen. Now, retrieval practice works most effectively if students distribute their retrieval practice over time rather than trying to cram. So one of the best forms of memory hacks that we can teach our students is to develop a program of spaced repetition like the one that you can see illustrated on this particular slide. So the idea behind spaced repetition is to go back over material but to leave a longer gap after each particular spaced repetition. So when you've initially learned some new material, maybe an optimum time to test yourself on that material would be maybe 24 hours later. Then you might want to leave it another 2 or 3 days. Then you might want to leave it a week. Then you might want to revisit it at longer intervals, such as every month. And as you can see on this particular graph, with every review, this forgetting curve that I talked about earlier in my presentation, that forgetting curve begins to flatten out. So spaced repetition, coming back to material at the point that you're beginning to forget it, is a very powerful memory hack. And of course the idea behind increasing the spaces between each repetition is to keep the retrieval practice difficult. So you actually want to allow a little bit of forgetting to have started, because that will make the retrieval practice cognitively difficult. And remember that memory is the residue of thought. We don't want this process to be too easy. Now, at the end of the last academic year, I got my colleague John Webber to carry out some in-depth qualitative interviews with some of my students who had been using these techniques of retrieval practice and space repetition during the year. So you can see students here articulating some of the principles that I've developed during this screencast. So here's another student who in her first year admitted that she was mainly doing things like rereading, highlighting, writing summaries, and she completely switched her approach in the second year. Now, the final thing that I want to mention in this presentation are two online systems that I think are potentially quite useful in putting these principles into practice. And the first is called Memrise. Now, Memrise is essentially an online flashcard system, and it's very useful for getting students to learn terminology. So students are presented with key terms or acronyms that they've got to learn and their meanings, and Memrise allows students in a low stakes way to test themselves on whether or not they can recall the key terms that go with the definitions. Now, there are lots of online flashcard systems that students can use, but what I particularly like about Memrise is it seems to be underpinned by evidence-based principles from cognitive psychology. And in particular, I like the fact that Memrise is based on a space repetition system. So one of the things that can be quite difficult for students to organise is coming back to material and testing themselves again at the optimum time. And what I really like about Memrise is the algorithm that they use to get students to test themselves on material repeatedly during the year. So I think if students were to snack on Memrise during the whole year and get into a study regime of little but often, it would really reduce the amount of cramming that students might have to do at the end of a 2-year course when they're trying to learn lots and lots of key concepts. The other thing that is potentially useful about Memrise is that students can add images and audio to help them learn key words. And although I've not got the time to go into this in this particular presentation, that particular technique is known as dual coding, and there is some research from cognitive psychology that supports the efficacy of combining text and images when students are trying to remember things. And with Memrise, teachers can set up their own groups, and they can monitor how much time students are spending each week on testing themselves using this particular tool. The other online system that I like to use with my students is called Brainscape. And one of the ways in which I use Brainscape with my students is for space retrieval practice and also a technique called elaborative interrogation. So elaborative interrogation involves the learner looking for explanations for facts. So there's a sizable body of evidence, again, from cognitive psychology that suggests that prompting students to answer why and how questions facilitates learning. So here's an example of a flashcard that's based on the type of exam question that students might get for the World Sociology course. And then here's the answer side to that particular flashcard. So here are some suggested answers, but then at the bottom, underneath these particular bullet points, there are what I call elaborative interrogation questions, or EI questions. So these are questions that are designed to get students to think harder about the things that they're trying to remember, and to get them to elaborate on these very brief bullet points. And again, it's based on this idea of memory being the residue of thought, that if students are actually thinking harder about the things that they are trying to remember, then that will really help them recall that information for the exam. The other thing that I like about Brainscape is you can also add hyperlinks to your flashcards. So for example, this has got a hyperlink to a video that I've made on this particular topic. So if students are struggling to remember and understand these particular points, then they've got a video lesson that can help them go back over the material.